Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, revenue surge, delivery stall, Ryanair back for more Maxes, go first, go south, and we reflect on Alan Joyce's legacy at Qantas. Hello, my name's Graham Dunn, and joining me as ever is Airline Business Editor Lewis Harper.
Hi Graham, how are you?
Yes, not bad at all, not bad at all. And it's, we have got through that first quarter period, or for most airlines now, especially in North America and Europe, when the results have been coming out. And that's always an intriguing time, isn't it? It's, I guess, the first chance to do a health check of the industry.
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's obviously a key feature of that quarter for a lot of airlines in the two regions you mentioned, is that in a lot of cases airlines would be expecting to make losses, and that's certainly the case in a number of carriers in the most recent reporting season. I think obviously the outlooks for the rest of the year are probably the most interesting thing to come out of this, and I think broadly most airlines are reporting that the really strong pent-up demand that characterised kind of the second half of 2022 is not showing any signs of abating. And of course, one of the reasons we, or some observers of the industry, were a bit sceptical about that pent-up demand was that clearly the economic outlook sort of going into 2023 was a bit bleak. And obviously it's helped a bit that the outlook has improved a bit in a number of ways. Of course, fuel prices have started coming down. So yeah, that kind of the positivity that we talked about over the last couple of earnings seasons has continued. And one thing that really stood out for me as well was that in Europe in particular, covering those results, is it kind of felt like the first time we really were back to business as usual. So, you know, sort of results comparable with 2019, and airlines kind of settling into this kind of new normal, and you know, reaching the point where we can go back to year on year comparisons, because you know, for so long it was kind of madness to compare the industry at where it was with a year earlier, just because you know it was shut down, for example. But yeah, so there's definitely a degree of normality coming back, I think.
A degree of normality, or a degree of it being more boring, which of course as journalists we to some extent we've been spoiled by extraordinary narratives that we've been on. But you're absolutely right. For airlines, it's you could say boring, but it's about predictable and sort of understanding what is going to come. As you said, is that the first quarter for North American and for European carriers is always a bit odd, because you have this kind of mixed narrative where they most carriers are making a loss, a relatively small loss, and those losses were much more comparable with the pre-pandemic levels. It was the same story. Revenues are still ridiculously high. We've heard quite recently from Virgin Atlantic, who their capacity levels are at 4/5 of what they were pre-pandemic. But the revenues are essentially at the same level as 2019. And that's a sort of story across the board where almost regardless of model or market, yields just remain strong. And I think that was a message across the board, that the revenues were still ridiculously strong, weren't they?
They were, and that comes, despite the fact that a lot of carriers are still seeing business travel as lagging the kind of strong leisure travel recovery. So these strong yields are happening with business travel in a lot of cases still sort of 60-70% of 2019 levels. And now maybe a year ago, if you'd said that would be the case at this point, you might have been worried. But of course, really offsetting that is this really strong leisure demand, even up into the kind of premium cabins. And it's striking that so many of the network carriers seem pretty relaxed about that lag in the business travel recovery, just because they are seeing such strong demand. So yeah, that's a trend to watch out for. Most airlines that did put a figure on it expect business travel maybe to get back up to 80-85% of pre-COVID times. We still heard some chief executives like Scott Kirby will insist that business travel will come back 100%. Obviously it will reach a point where it's hard to measure where the recovery is, but at the moment the industry is pretty comfortable with that passenger mix, and it might be adjusting products here and there. BA talking about the sort of higher importance of premium economy and that kind of environment. But yeah, a lot going on that's quite interesting. And I think one thing Lufthansa talks about, and I think a couple of US carriers have mentioned as well, that a consequence of this this kind of shift in the passenger balance is that Q1 might be a bit weaker than it was pre-COVID, because obviously it tends to be the big leisure travel months are across the middle of the year. So there's a seasonality effect that might be a longer term trend we'll see, where if there is a kind of structural slight decline in business travel that used to sustain airlines more in the first quarter of the year, that might be reflected in results. But no, I don't think anyone's panicking about that as such.
Confidence is high. United's Chief Operations Officer, Toby Enqvist, he described summer as our Super Bowl, which I think sort of says a lot about the year ahead. And, Delta's head Bastian was talking about demand never having been so high. And you're absolutely right. There's this idea that, the first quarter, any sort of loss of momentum in the first quarter is more than covered by the strong bookings over the summer period. And as you say, perhaps that's indicative of, at least for this year and the coming years, an element to which there is greater seasonality in that period. And of course, we saw that last year with this, which was obviously not a deliberate plan, which was to write off traffic in the first 3 months of the year. But obviously, you saw how strongly that came back in the summer. And it sort of mirrors that to some extent, though obviously in a kind of gradually moving towards maybe more regular patterns. Of course, one of the issues with so much being backed on the summer is the importance of capacity. And obviously, this time last year with the ramp up, you were seeing a lot of concerns around how airports were meeting that demand. And I wouldn't say that issue's completely gone away, but that people seem to be slightly calmer about that side. And probably the bigger capacity issue is around actually getting the aircraft flying, both new aircraft deliveries and the supply chain issues, which are causing some issues around keeping aircraft operating in the air. And I suppose that aircraft issue is probably the biggest one facing airlines at the moment.
I think so, yeah. I think there's a sense you got from the earnings calls that when you mentioned the challenges around airports, and of course when we say that, it's not necessarily the businesses running the airports that were always to blame. Of course, the airlines themselves have had staffing challenges and the ground handlers. But yeah, and there is a sense, clearly we've been through last summer, and it'd be pretty poor to see airlines not preparing for what's ahead of this summer, talking up the demand so strongly. So Lufthansa, for example, said it was taking a productivity hit this coming summer by making sure it had a bit of wriggle room around staffing and aircraft availability, etc., to ensure we don't see they do their part in ensuring we don't see a repeat of operational challenges. IAG talked about their favourite topic of Heathrow, and I'm saying they hope that Heathrow's got everything in order for the coming summer. And yeah, so from that point of view, you're right. There's a degree of confidence, even if no one is obviously saying I'm sure it will all be fine, because some of those kind of staffing issues in particular are going to take longer than a few months to recover. But as you say, the big story that seems to spread across a lot more airlines than we were talking about last year is the availability of aircraft. And there are obviously two issues there. The one is delays to deliveries, which has become a bit of a theme. On the one hand, I think one that appears to be more pressing at the moment is MRO delays. So, and obviously Pratt & Whitney have been the subject of many stories relating to that, although clearly the situation is not unique to them. But obviously, if there's a lack of spare engines, which relates to a lack of spare parts, which again comes from the supply chain challenges that were talked about a lot as we came out of the COVID-19 crisis. And yeah, essentially, a number of airlines now have said that they're seeing their aircraft on the ground for a long time, much longer than they expect and they want. And as I say, we're saying that spread. We've heard it variously, most recently from Lufthansa Group, again talking about Swiss's A220s. We know that A220s seem to be particularly vulnerable to this. I think that's partly because I think some of the challenges have focused on the newer generation aircraft. Obviously, not such a big pool, I guess, of second-hand parts there, for example, and Air Baltic have talked a lot about this, grounding several of their aircraft for weeks and weeks longer, or months and months in some cases, than they would have wanted. So yeah, it's a thing we talked about before, but it really is spreading now to a lot more carriers, I think.
And perhaps one of the highest profile of these is Go First, the Indian low-cost carrier, which formerly operated as Go Air. It's just in fact had approved a move into an insolvency bankruptcy protection process. It was supposed to ground flights earlier in May, which are currently grounded until the 19th of May, and it cited a shortage of aircraft, and specifically because of the engine failures or the lack of engines for its Airbus A320neos, the Pratt & Whitney engines. Now, there are probably wider issues in the Indian market. Go Air, which was the third largest carrier in the Indian domestic market last year, but had an 8 or 9% market share, kind of illustrating the dominance of Indigo and the Air India carriers, or what are to become the Air India carriers. I think once you add in Air India, Vistara, Asia, Air India Express, together with Indigo, that's going to be about 85% of the market. So India is a notoriously difficult market to operate in, but Go First is issues compounded by the challenges around aircraft availability, and it says around half of its Airbus fleet is available. I mean, that's an issue that's sort of being contested now within the courts between Pratt & Whitney and Go First. But it's a reminder of the challenges that a lack of aircraft availability can bring. Now, Ryanair is another airline which has been impacted. Boeing, obviously, some of its 737 MAX aircraft, there was a further delivery delay on this summer, and Ryanair was indicating some of its MAX deliveries would be impacted by that. But true to form, Ryanair, which has now been one to shy away from a crisis, has been back ordering aircraft again.
Yeah, it feels like every Ryanair press conference I've been to over the past couple of years is the question is, are you talking to Boeing about a MAX 10 order? And up until recently, the answer was often no, because they were nowhere near on price. But we knew it was coming. Really, I think it was always unlikely they would switch to Airbus aircraft. They operate a small number, I think, still in Austria and within the group, but certainly, we knew this was going to come eventually, so no great surprise there. The agreement covers up to 300 of the type. I think the crucial detail, obviously, is it's the MAX 10, so it's a bigger aircraft than is seen currently in Ryanair's fleet. I think it's 228 seats, so a good 30 or more seats above what they currently operate. This isn't, I don't think, Ryanair is obviously, it's been a growth story for so long. I think these are aircraft incoming towards the end of the decade and into the next decade. They're obviously receiving MAX jets, plenty more of them to come, as in the smaller variants of that family. But Ryanair is inevitably heading towards a period where its growth is not going to continue at double-digit rates. It can't continue like that indefinitely, particularly when it's heading towards a fleet size of about 500-600 aircraft before long. So it's interesting to watch. I guess in moderating its growth, what the MAX 10 gives it is that bigger aircraft to fly on routes where the demand's there. Worth noting, of course, that in doing so, it should be another unit cost advantage for the airline. It ensures that competitors like Wizz Air, which with A321neos, for example, doesn't have an inbuilt advantage in having its larger aircraft than Ryanair. It makes a lot of sense, and we knew it was coming. But still, always when Ryanair place these orders, always mind-boggling figures involved, and a big order, and an endorsement of the MAX program, which continues to certainly have its ups and downs. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is interesting. Ryanair has done this before. So Ryanair, these aircraft are coming at 2027, so there'll be a short gap a year or 18 months or so between the last of its current MAX aircraft coming in, which Michael O'Leary says kind of it suits them to take a break for a year after, I think he describes it as a tumultuous decade of growth beforehand. They did this before. They had a couple of, again, in between their previous Boeing orders, and they had a period, a couple of years or so, which did kind of enable them to focus a little bit more on route profitability. And you saw quite a lot of churn within the market. To what extent that is a deliberate ploy, and to what extent that is just like an accident in terms of that's the earnest to get its aircraft, is another issue. But Ryanair has historically timed its aircraft orders very well. We've seen it able to grow through the crisis, and at this stage, I think it would be fair to say that Ryanair seems to have had a good recovered swiftly from the pandemic. It will be at, I think, 160 odd million passengers this year already, some sort of 10, 15 million above where it was pre-crisis. So continues to be a strong story, Ryanair.
It does, as ever. And I think, circling back to the sort of capacity constraints sort of situation we've been talking about, I think, Ryanair is strong growth. And, as you talked about, it's had its own challenges of incoming orders. And I think a theme to watch, certainly in the nearer term, with these supply chain challenges that are affecting deliveries and the MRO situation at a number of carriers, is constrained capacity is not necessarily a bad thing, particularly coming out of a crisis where there are a few startups around, but a lot of the established players have survived the crisis and emerging quite strongly. And obviously we're seeing yields very high. So Lufthansa, for example, has only started the year in the 70s in terms of percentage capacity compared with 2019 levels in a lot of markets. So the constrained capacity when you're a strong player in the market is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's the unpredictable nature of what we're seeing with some of these MRO and delivery challenges that aren't good for airlines, and whether you're cancelling flights because of it at the last minute, you're reneging on wet lease deals, whatever. It's the unpredictable nature of it that's a problem. Also worth noting, of course, that Asia as a market for particularly European airlines is coming back relatively strongly compared with where we were last year. But IAG talks about it taking years to get back to where it was for them, and again, that means they're not having to assign so many aircraft into that market while these capacity constraints are in place, which is actually in a way quite helpful for them. So it's a theme that we'll see continue for a while, yes, I think.
Absolutely. So after the break, we will look into the legacy of one of the longest standing airline CEOs whose departure has just been announced for this autumn. If you're enjoying this podcast, why not sign up for our free weekly airline business briefing delivered directly to your inbox every Thursday? You can register to get our weekly briefings together with any of Flight Global's other newsletters for free at flightglobal.com/newsletter. So welcome back, and we're talking about Qantas and Alan Joyce, who after 15 years at the helm of the airline is stepping down in the autumn to be placed by Vanessa Hudson, who's currently Chief Financial Officer, I think, at the airline. And now, Lewis, it's fair to say that Alan Joyce has been a massive figure, obviously at Qantas and within the Australian aviation scene, but I think the industry as a whole, hasn't he?
He has. He's been someone who's relatively high profile at events like the IATA AGM, obviously notably including a 2018 event. Qantas was the host airline. He's been a strong voice on issues like diversity and inclusion within Qantas and the industry. So yes, he's someone who's has always been interesting to hear from. And I think when you look at his the headlines from his tenure, it's kind of marked by, at the beginning, he was bringing Qantas out of the global financial crisis, and then obviously the end of his time with Qantas is bringing the carrier out of the COVID-19 crisis. And I think on certain levels, I think he's had a lot of success. But having said that, there has been some debate over his legacy, hasn't there?
Yes, I mean, I think from a kind of consumer perspective and also from a labour perspective, Joyce has always probably been a little bit of a divisive figure. I mean, he's never been one to be afraid of making tough decisions, and very much early on in taking a very tough line in essentially shutting down the airline to break a strike. So, always taking a tough line on Labour, which you maybe not a surprise. Perhaps he came some criticism from that. Again, we've seen, I think it's bold decisions throughout the way. Again, Qantas had a very long-standing relationship with British Airways and oneworld and operating routes through Singapore. And obviously, it was, a game-changing move to switch that base through to Emirates and to tie up with the Emirates. Joyce has never been afraid to make those big calls. Probably his most recent challenges and the things that have probably contributed to quite a lot of maybe the bad press that he's faced more recently is around the service ramp up, which in fairness, Qantas is far from alone in having had some challenges with that, but Qantas certainly had some difficulties with that, and he last year had to apologise for the levels of service that they had during the summer. So not an easy time for Alan Joyce over these last couple of years in particular.
No, exactly, and it's hard to judge really how much of that bad press is partly a result of, as you say, his willingness to make those big calls and tough decisions that upset a lot of people over his entire tenure, making him vulnerable to, or people being particularly quick to criticise him. Because as you say, I don't think a lot of the issues faced by Qantas and its customers, particularly around the operational ramp up, were that unique to the airline. I think in a lot of countries, the freedom of the press to be so openly critical wouldn't be a consideration. So not to say it wasn't deserved in some cases, but certainly from outside looking in, it's there's a degree of a lack of clarity over how justified that was. But as you say, he's made the big decisions. I mean, Qantas was, in Australia more generally, was an interesting story during the pandemic. Obviously, a big reliance on international traffic as Australia's flag carrier, but the domestic market was also a bit challenging during the pandemic. Not quite the open domestic market we might have seen in some other large countries where individual states in Australia had different rules around the pandemic, so it wasn't quite the smooth sailing domestically that it was in some areas. So his legacy is most widely reported as a bit of a mixed one. Ultimately, I think shareholders seem broadly positive about where the airline is as a business, but maybe the narrative is that he's upset quite a few people along the way. And there is a sense that Vanessa Hudson, who's coming in to replace him, has a job to do to repair some relationships, and maybe it is a natural evolution of that. Joyce has done the work to get the business in the right place. Now it's the time to make sure customers and employees are happy, because clearly it's not a complete story without those two.
As you say, financially, actually a strong recovery from Qantas, so well placed there. Maybe a bit of image restoring required. But it's interesting, isn't it, that his successor is Vanessa Hudson. It's a female leader, and sort of diversity and inclusion. Very few leaders have championed that in the way that Alan Joyce has in his time at Qantas. And, it goes far beyond that he is replaced by a female leader. It is that kind of level of diversity and inclusion is embedded in the airline, isn't it?
Yeah, Joyce was talking about this long before it became a big cause for the wider industry. Of course, ironically, one of the main things that prompted the wider industry to put something formal in place through IATA around diversity and inclusion when it came to gender diversity, at least, was Akbar al-Bakar's kind of ill-judged joke in quotation marks at the Sydney AGM, where he made those comments sitting next to Alan Joyce, and the contrast there is quite stark. I mean, Joyce at that point was nearly 10 years into his tenure, and from day one he'd really made, as you say, diversity and inclusion an important part of that. I think in Australia and other countries it kind of was already higher up the agenda, so that helps a bit, but certainly he really did focus on that and believed it makes for a better business using a lot of the arguments we talked about before, the different voices you have, the wider pool of talent you can call upon if you make sure everyone feels comfortable and able to be themselves at work. So yeah, he made that a big focus, and it is fitting that he's replaced by a woman at Qantas. Stephanie Tully is already she was promoted to be CEO of low cost arm Jetstar last year, I think. Olivia Worth is CEO of Qantas Loyalty. So there aren't many other airlines where you can really cite some probably medium sort of long term focus on diversity and inclusion, really showing through in creating those role models that are really important. And whenever we talk to IATA about why it's important we have women leading airlines, and one of the things they'll say is it's without role models it's really hard for people to imagine themselves getting to those types of positions. So I think Joyce has acknowledged that there's a lot of work to do still to make sure Qantas workforce fully reflects the diversity of Australian society, but we talked about the debate around his legacy in broader terms, but certainly on diversity and inclusion, I don't know, Air France KLM, for example, has 2 female chief executives on KLM and Air France. Qantas is going to have 3 female chief executives if there are no changes before Hudson comes in. So there are a few groups that are kind of leading the charge, and Joyce, I think, can be quite proud of that legacy. Whatever anyone says about the rest of what he's done there, it's a strong story, and hopefully something we'll see more of in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I think that's probably all we have time for this week. Thank you, Lewis, for your time.
Thank you, Graham.
As a reminder, you can find links to all the stories you've referenced in the podcast notes, and you can keep up to date with all the latest stories from across the industry at flightglobal.com. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you again next time.